Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a cold steel Kriegsmesser. Now, this one was sent to me from Sword Friend Ian originally on loan, and later he decided to let me keep it for me to messer around with his own punny dad jokes there. So first, tip of my hat to Sword Friend Ian for sending me this example to review and share with you. I do want to note that there's some potential bias when somebody sends you something and you don't have your own money in it, but more to the point, this is now a gift, and I tend to get the warm fuzzies, and I'm humbled when people give me swords as gifts. Now, vendor review samples are one thing. Vendors usually have some skin in the game. When an individual out there, a sword friend, sends me a sword, I'm humbled by that, and I get the warm fuzzies around it. And I suppose you should know that bias exists. The other bit to note is that I don't study historic European martial arts. I do study swordsmanship of a different variety, but I don't know the systems which would use this sword to its full potential. So keep those caveats in mind as you hear my babbling. Speaking of babbling, the intent of this video is to tell you if it's, or at least help you decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. It's about $400 at retail, $380 on Cult of Athena right now, and hopefully you can mute the video, and the photos and all that kind of stuff will give you some idea of what to expect and if it's worth your money or not. But I will walk you through the build quality, then show you some uses, the consequences of those uses, of which there are some foreshadowing there, and then at the end I'll tell you if I think it's worth it or not. So, anyway, on with the show. The first bit to note is, again, that $400 price point, or $380 if you're being thrifty and buying it from Cult of Athena or maybe somewhere else. There's not a lot of other messers in that category, so there's not a huge amount to compare it to. Initially, when I opened the box, I was like, oh, it looks like the Albion Connect from Wish. It looks like a derpy cousin of the Albion Connect, and it doesn't. In fairness, it's $400, and there's just not a huge amount of offerings in that price category. There's some certainly that are less expensive, but none that are quite so big or quite the same shape, and also around the $400 price point. So another feather in this sword's cap in that it's not got a huge amount of competition out there. In terms of general build quality, note that I am going to measure and put weapon dynamics and all that stuff in the description down below, so if you're interested in any of that, along with links to other reviewers that I've enjoyed watching on this sword, because it's a pretty new offering from Cold Steel, but fortunately there's some people out there that have shared their thoughts on YouTube already, and I'll put all those links in the description down below. As is tradition, I'm going to start with the pommel, the end bit. Now, the construction on here is, I suppose, worth noting, just because sometimes these construction methods vary. This does appear to be an actual pommel, in that this is a blob of metal that has been sanded to fit the kind of quintessential shape of a Messer pommel, if you will, or something that I see as a distinctively a Messer pommel. But it is a blob of metal with a peen that runs through, and then it is peened on. Sometimes these are scales that are set on the side, or sometimes I can make out the tang that runs through it or is slotted in some way. Here, it appears that the tang ends and there's a pommel that goes out the end. Also worth noting, not a pommel, a peen that goes out the end and then is smashed on. Some notes on here, it doesn't move around, so presumably they've got the tang slotted in some sort of square way where it doesn't move, because I beat on this with a hammer and dropped it and put it through some abusive things, you might say, and nothing is loosened up. I also don't feel any metal or anything to even catch a fingernail on where the pommel or where the peen has been smashed down. I don't see any hammer marks. Whatever they've done, they've sanded it away, so it's overall a reasonably clean presentation. In terms of shape, there's a slight swell that's going to help you in retention. No hot spots or anything that bites in, but there's some dimension here in that the wells that run down the guard run all the way through into this pommel section, and you can use them to aid your grip, which they certainly do. And again, no hot spots, but some definition. There's also a lot of asymmetry and tool marks on here. Now, again, for a $400 sword, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily bad, but if you're particular about some of those details and asymmetry or kind of unevenness or crudeness bothers you, then there's abundance of that on here. There's also some gaps between the pommel and the scales that look like they've been filled in by some sort of epoxy or resin or something like that. Overall, they're pretty small, but worth knowing that they're there. It's not a perfectly symmetrical, even Steven kind of approach here. It's been filled in and futzed with a little bit to give some tolerance between where the scales fit in, because woodworking is hard. Anyway, that's going to bring us up to the grip here. So there's a section here. Again, I've got the measurements down there. I want to say that this grip piece, the wooden scales, are about 9 inches. There's 4 brass pins, or copper pins, I should say, that are recessed in. They're not hollow, so they're not something you can attach a lanyard to, like I've seen on some other messers, but I don't believe this is ahistoric or bad or anything. You can make out very clearly the tang that runs through here. It's exposed. It tends to get rusty as well, and there's ample tool marks on it. Then there's also these very deep wells along the center of the grip, and it's more or less a boxy grip. You can maybe notice some taper in here. It swells maybe just ever so slightly, but it's pretty much a rectangular grip, and these wells really lock your fingers into place in such a way that you feel an extreme amount of purchase on the grip. I'm always nervous when I see these relatively smooth wood grips here that it's going to be slippery, but I was cutting water bottles, my hands got wet, I never used a glove, and it always felt really rock solid in my hand. It was very easy for me to get purchase, to get grip on this handle here, and I never felt like it was wiggling around or trying to escape my grip. So good there. Worth noting as well, though, that these rectangular pieces could be rounded a little bit. They hurt. So there's no hot spots on the grip, but there are some pretty extreme kind of angles on here that when you impact something and you're not running all the way through the target, that vibration when it goes into your hand, this kind of metal or this wooden ridge here just jams into the fat of my hand, and I didn't find it to be particularly fun to cut with when I was impacting sticks or things that I didn't cut through. So when there was impact, when I felt the vibration of that impact, it was not comfortable and not fun. And since, as I understand it, these weapons were, breaking pipe formations, and that you might be, bashing into something that you don't necessarily cleave in twain, that's not necessarily a great thing. Now, I think you could resolve that by sanding down at least some of the back portion. There's plenty of meat here on the scales for me to customize it slightly. I didn't opt to do that right now, but at some point, given that this is mine, I think if I'm going to hang on to this, I'm going to want to adjust the grip a little bit, because while it's great in terms of retaining, it's not comfortable to cut with, at least as soon as you have any kind of impact or anything that makes the sword handle wiggle in your hand. It comes back, and it doesn't bite me to the blood, but it does. Well, it makes me uncomfortable. I guess I've said that, belabored the point enough. Anyway, blade node is right about where it's supposed to be in the grip as well. I do want to note some of the weapon dynamic stuff down below, and I'm going to mention it because the grip is an important facet of that. One, I noted that it feels like you really lock into the handle, albeit you might not want to be that locked in when you cut something. You do feel immediately locked in, and the blade node is right at the end of the fuller here, and it's kind of in the top third of the blade, and you just feel immediately connected to this space on the cutting plane of the blade. It also feels relatively nimble. I feel like I could poke somebody and be reasonably well controlled with the tip, but it just feels really, really connected right to where you're going to want to impact with the sword. So I like the dynamic properties of the sword as well. It feels very connected to the part of the sword that I want to hit things with, and that makes it dynamically feel very, very fun in the hand. It's 3.5 pounds-ish, or a little less, I want to say, than 3.5 pounds, but a little 3 pounds, 4.8 ounces, I believe is what I had this one at. That's in the description down below as well. So it's not a light sword, but it does feel reasonably comfortable in one hand. I'm getting the dynamic side of it, but I suppose I more or less wanted to mention that as I'm locked into this, I feel connected to the right spot on the blade, and that is something that sings a little bit about this sword in the hand. When you hold it, it feels like, oh, I'm kind of surprised. This feels really nice. I was kind of expecting it to be derpy, and it's not derpy. Not derpy like maybe it looks a little bit. All right, anyway, moving on to the crossguard, and this is where I have perhaps my first major criticism of the sword. All the other imperfections and stuff I could either modify or work around, but this is something that's a little tougher. One, the shoulders do appear to rest inside the guard, so they don't run through. Again, construction method, it looks like this guard is rested up from the bottom rather than slid down from the top. And the nagel goes through, but I believe it's round. So basically this crossguard wiggles around a little bit, and it feels like it's really being held in place by the scales and the wood here, and gradually this is loosened up. So I can rattle it around a little bit. And the nagel, unfortunately, got damaged in shipping and was twisting a little bit when I took it out of the box. The nagel had kind of protruded through the cardboard that I got from Sword Friend Ian. And I've taken some steps to remedy it. So now it doesn't move around as much, but I had to clamp it in a vise and just really beat the snot out of it and really maim the surface of this sword to get it to be stable again. So I think the nagel should probably not be a circular peg that runs through, and I think there maybe needs to be some adjustment in how this crossguard is slotted on, because it developed a wiggle pretty quickly, and that's pretty unfortunate. So I believe there was some resin or some epoxy in there as well. Most of that got knocked out, and anyway, it's reasonably secure now, but it wiggles, and no matter what I did with a hammer, it didn't really secure itself on there anymore. I got the nagel not to twist and turn around, but at the same time, I couldn't really secure this guard with the current configuration, shy of really compressing around the slot in the crossguard, which appears to be big. There's a reasonable amount of gap around the area in the crossguard, the hole where the blade meets the crossguard. It's not necessarily anything that impedes usage, but it's a mark of quality, and larger gaps let in more debris, water, things like that from cutting. Smaller gaps are harder to do, take more time, and so it's a small sign of attention to detail on a blade, and I like to see it smaller. This one is not terrible, but at the same time, I think is an opportunity for improvement. I like the overall shape of the guard. I happen to think it's a handsome looking thing, but it seems to be the poorest of the construction. I don't know if it's that the shoulders are resting inside, because typically I see messers slide down the blade and then are peened through with the nagel and then kind of compressed on. At least that's how I've seen Lance Connect Emporium do it, and their stuff hasn't developed wiggles on me. This one, whatever method they're using, which does appear to be slid up the bottom because the shoulders rest somewhere in the guard here. The space here is bigger than the space down here. And the nagel, it's just developed some sort of looseness. And so I think that's a disappointment, right? If even though it's a $400 sword, even though some of this might be things that you can fix or tolerate, ideally you're not developing rattle right out of the gate. And UPS is known for kicking boxes all the way. I think that this likely would have happened in some usage and not... It didn't look particularly damaged or smushed from UPS. It just looked like it, maybe got dropped on its face a few times. You're not supposed to do that, but it's a weapon of war. And so if this got struck with anything or whacked, I think it likely would have happened anyway. But again, with some percussive maintenance, I was able to secure the nagel. I think I could maybe futz with this a little bit more. It just hasn't worked out. Anyway, wrapping up some thoughts on the crossguard, I happen to think it's handsome. I like that it goes from a narrow area to a wider area. It has some dimension to it, and so I overall like the aesthetics of the guard. I just wish it was more resilient. All right, sword friends, I'm going to tell you about the blade, the pointy stabby part. Now, in profile, I like the gentle curve of the blade. I like the fuller that runs about 2/3 of the way up the blade and actually terminates in approximately the same spot. I like the implementation of distal taper here. It has an elegance and kind of refinement to it that I just didn't expect to see in a $400 sword. It has a satin blade polish on it, and not really polished, but it's finished at about a 400 or 800 grit, somewhere in there kind of area, and it has some surface ripples and things like that, but not so much that I would say they're problematic for a sword in this price point. And so overall, general look of the blade, it has a lot of features, and I'm overall really impressed with kind of the appearance of it. There's opportunities. It has a pretty obtuse edge angle that was put on. The sharpening also started about 3 or 4 inches up. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but it kind of makes an obvious transition that goes in here. I didn't put a better edge on it. I think I could, but with a new sword, I don't think you should necessarily have to. Though this one did impress me with some of the water bottle cutting I was able to do. Anyway, the dynamics of the sword as well are pretty nice. I like that the blade node is kind of in the top third of the blade. I feel like I have a lot of tip control, though I'll talk a little bit more about moving it in just a second. Just the general aesthetics of the blade are pretty nice, and I don't necessarily have a whole lot to gripe about here. There's opportunities for more refinement, to do a slightly better job in polishing the sword, to do a better job on sharpening. But I still think they pack really a lot in here for what you're getting for $400. My concern around the blade came with some usage. So initially I cut water bottles, I cut some thin branches, things like that, and I didn't experience any problems with any of those targets. And in fact, as I noted, I was kind of impressed with the ability to cut water bottles, given that I thought this was going to bat them around more than cut them. And in usage, I thought it lined up pretty well, or dynamically felt pretty good. But later in cutting, I did some more aggressive cuts, and that's when I started to experience some bending. Later, I then tested the HRC on the blade. So down here, kind of at the ricasso area, or this part near the crossguard, my 50 file doesn't bite in. My 55 file just kind of barely bites in, and I don't know what that means necessarily, but I'm thinking it's more towards the 55 side, right? So the 60 file bites in very deeply down here. But up here, where I'm doing most of the cutting, well, my 40 file kind of bites in. My 45 file definitely bites in. So it's a little softer right in this area where I experience the bending. Now, I didn't heat the sword up or do anything, but it's my I'm going to speculate here anyway that to get this distal taper, there was a lot of grinding necessary to do it. Some of it might have been done on the forge or hammered out. I don't know. There's some hammer marks in here that look like it had some element of forging, but I imagine the heat treatment just got screwed up in grinding. I bet a lot of this was hogged off in heat treatment. There's also a lot going on here. There's a fuller that's terminating. It's a pretty aggressive part on the distal taper side, and it's thinning out on the other side. And anyway, this section up here is where I experienced bending, and it's significantly softer than the other part of the sword, kind of down by the hilt. So I think the heat treatment on the example that I have is not great, and my hope is that I would be getting kind of a springy sword that would be very forgiving and that kind of stuff. Not that I can't bend or chip or roll or that it's got to be indestructible, but I could smack it on the side of a tree to get the bend out or to put one in, and it's just a little bit more bendy than I think it should be, a little bit softer than I think it should be, and I think it's because of the things that I liked before, the fuller, the distal taper, to put those in and maintain the heat treatment on it is a challenging thing to do, and I think that got missed here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the blade. Hopefully that is helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about moving it around. Nothing that I really haven't mentioned already here, in that I thought it felt really great moving it around. I like how my hand locks in. There's not a lot of discomfort in swinging or holding it. As I mentioned, when you impact something, I did find some discomfort in my hands, but generally I feel like I have some amount of tip control, that I could put the tip where I wanted it to be. And as my hand is locked in here, I feel immediately connected to where the blade node is and where I'd want to strike with this sword. And I found it to be a very easy sword to cut with, and dynamically it feels wonderful in the hand. I don't move swords like this around a whole lot, but this one I happen to feel immediately connected to, and it feels like a pretty well designed weapon, dynamically speaking. Measurements that I took are in the description down below. Anyway, in terms of using, as I noted, I cut water bottles, I cut branches, I cut some small things, and then I gradually moved up to more aggressive things. I was impressed that this kind of obtuse, not terribly sharp edge was able to cut water bottles as well as it did, because my aptitude at cutting them isn't particularly great. I'm not great with these swords, and anyway, the water bottles seem to go well in some cases. And I expected it to just kind of bat them around more than anything. It didn't. It successfully cut some of those things. Branches, it could move through some of those as well. Initially, I didn't suspect any kind of issues with heat treatment, and it wasn't until later when I started cutting brush and thicker stuff. I moved to a different house, and I've got a little bit bigger yard and some brush to clean up, and so I brought this out as a tool to knock down some branches and stuff, and that's when I noticed the bending side of it. And that's I suppose the most concerning thing. The hilt I could beat with a hammer. It might wiggle around, but a lot of people aren't actually sparring with these. It'd be great if this thing was sorted as well. But the blade, a lot of people are going to go whack sticks in the backyard, or something with it. If you're cutting really bad cuts on water bottles or miss and whack your stand, some of that force as well may yield you a bent blade. And so that's the concerning part that I had. Otherwise, I did put the sword through a reasonable amount. Other parts of it, the scales have held on pretty well. The pommel doesn't wiggle around. The edge has maintained reasonably well, even though it was pretty obtuse at the start. I think there are elements on the sword from a cutting and usage perspective that are nice, but the bending for at least the type of stuff I did was a little below expectations. Anyway, I did cut things successfully, and it's still in one piece, albeit with some concerns. So do I personally think the blade is worth it or not? Short answer for me is no. And the reason is that there's too many things in combination that diminish my confidence in the sword being a sword and doing sword-like things. The guard wiggling around like it does, the naggle coming loose and shipping, albeit UPS to blame for some of it, but this is a weapon of war, right? This hilt is supposed to take some abuse before it really starts to loosen like this, let alone falling on its face a few times from UPS. That in combination with what I suspect is an issue with heat treatment is enough to make me lose some confidence in the sword. And that's hard for me to say. I want to like it. One, because it's a gift. I told you that at the front, but there's a lot to be admired in this attempt. Dynamically speaking, the sword feels good in the hand, which is hard to do for a mass production sword. The blade nodes are in about the right spot. It's got some distal taper on it, just things that you don't see in a lot of mass production swords, or swords at $400, generally speaking. And the other things that I don't like, maybe the grip or something like that, are things that theoretically, even with my minimal skill, I could address. I really wish that the hilt was more durable and that the blade was better heat treated, and then I would certainly say, yes, it's worth the money. Unfortunately, the example I have, that isn't the case. So anyway, there are things to admire though. If you don't have those issues, or there's something about this profile that you want to train with and you're not going to strike anything like I do, or maybe having to maim the surface of the steel to make it more resilient isn't a bother to you, or you have some way to resolve what I suspect to be a heat treatment issue, then maybe this is worth it for you, because it certainly is not, it doesn't have a whole lot of competition for a sword like this with these features. So anyway, I wish I liked it. I wish I liked it. There's a lot to like here. I wish that the issues that I mentioned were addressed. And if they are, then I think this would definitely be a yes for me. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Special thanks again to Sword for Ian for sending this my way. I'm going to play around with this. It's still a sword that I can use and play with and compare to other messers from a measurement perspective and do some light cutting with. So there's still opportunity for me to really enjoy this one. That's all I've got. Hopefully it was interesting. Cheers, and thanks for watching.